If you plan to ingest terabytes or petabytes of logs into Dynatrace, we want to make sure you're following some of our best practices. Our best practices around bucket management, that means where to store your data and also how long to retain, about segments, which make it faster and easier to access and query data, and also around access control. So we have a new best practice guide around log management analytics, and I've invited Christian, who contributed to this best practice guide, to give us an overview so that you make sure that your data in Grail is stored efficiently, can be queried efficiently, and also is not breaking any of your cost budgets. Check this out. Welcome everyone to another observability lab. Today we are putting the focus on log management and analytics best practice. I've invited Christian. Servus, Christian.
Hello, good morning. Good afternoon.
Hi. Hey, thank you so much, first of all, for writing a great best practice guide that we now have for our Dynatrace users. And the best practice guide, we will focus, as always, when you watch these videos, check out the links in the description. Also, as Christian is going to show his content today, including live demos, watch out for these links that you see in those cards on YouTube. But Christian, today I really wanted to give you an opportunity to explain all the best practices on how to best leverage Dynatrace for log analytics. We will cover topics around buckets, segments, access control. I know you have a lot of great content that you packed in the best practice guide, but some people really prefer videos. So this is now the opportunity for the two of us, especially for you, to give us some best practice insights. And with this, Christian, maybe a quick explanation who you are, and then let's jump right into the topic.
Sure. Thank you very much. So as you already said, my name is Christian Schwendemann. I'm the go-to-market product manager for logs, which means I'm the one that connects with customers, collects feedback, but also internally with our product teams works on improving the products, but also guides like we now have in the product documentation. And one thing we often came across was that customers asked us, give me one place where I find all the details when it's about getting started with logs. Because what you see here is the power of Grail and logs also. And one of the things that customers in the beginning, when they start with logs, do not think about is how to properly segment all of this. Because you see, you can just put logs from basically anywhere. If it's one agent based, API ingested, open telemetry, if you use log forwarding and shippers like Gribble or Fluent or whatever you today have, you can send it to Dynatrace. And with Open Pipeline, you can manage how you want to make use of these logs. You can extract information from them. You can move logs to metrics, you can convert them. You can also create business events, or you can just throw everything into one single bucket, which is obviously not a best practice. Mm-hmm. And so to help people to get started and to explain how you can also, when you already have everything, optimize and help your teams to meaningfully adopt logs, we today are going to look into the best practices guide. Mm-hmm. And with this, we've prepared this quick slide. If you want to follow along what we are discussing, you can just scan this QR code or go to the product documentation yourself. And if you're watching this recording at a later time, just pause the video and open it in your browser. And as said, we've condensed the basic information in one place, which then has links to the follow-up details if there is something new to you. But let's get started, I guess, and look into what the actual details are. And with Dynatrace, you have so-called buckets. Buckets represent kind of a logical, maybe you want to call it like a folder or a storage area where you put all your logs. And that's not just true for logs, it's also true for other things, but today we're going to focus on logs. And what we come across very often is that customers start with a first bucket, put all the logs in there. And so in this case, we see here something called prod logs. So someone is ingesting 45 terabytes a day. And we've seen this in the real world. So they retain the logs in there for 10 days. And then at some point, developers said, I also want to have a bucket, 20 terabytes a day. And then they split it, audit logs and access logs. And so there is a good volume. The challenge here is if you run the query, the DQL, the Dynatrace query language command fetch logs, you're going by default to touch all of these buckets when you look for something. And out of the box, we have something that helps to limit the query results. And with this also, it's a performance on the one hand, but also on the other hand, a cost protection, because when you run a query, this is going to scan data, and actually querying data is where you create cost. So the default scan limit is set to 500 gigabytes. So if you now look at 45 terabytes and 20 terabytes and a few other buckets, obviously the results that you are looking for won't be there. And this is where customers then read the product documentation, and teams find that there is a command called scan limit gigabytes -1, which is just, I don't want any limitations. And this will result in something that you definitely don't want to have, because now one single query, one single refresh, very likely in such a scenario would be around about 80 terabytes of data you're scanning. And still, you're not going to look at what you actually are looking for, the prod logs. You're also going to see def logs, audit logs, access logs. And this is where it's important. And that's our first best practice also in the guide, to narrow the scope that you're looking for. So we want to still have the default scan limit, but we only want to look at the specific bucket where the data is in that we look for. So prod logs. So our DQL query can be fetch logs, bucket, prod logs. And that's something that you would, on the one hand, need to type or to select and filter in the filter bar, which we later are going to see. And there are also other options, which we're going to look in a second. But before we go there, if you now filter for the bucket, the challenge is, as we said, still that this bucket has 45 terabytes. And this is the second best practice we're discussing. Why would you want to split the bucket into multiple but smaller buckets? And the reason is what we explain here. If you take 45 terabytes and look at only 0.5 terabytes, so 500 gigabytes in your default scanning limits, this is just a few minutes of logs. So if you look for historic logs of the last like 4 or 5 hours, you already would need to set this scan limit -1. And you saw this would be way more data. While if you follow our best practice guide, and this is just an approximation, it's something that's depending on what type of logs and what team size and what structure you follow. And we've got some examples also in the best practices guide, but 2 to 4 terabytes for a bucket. This is for the 24 hours of ingest and retain about what you want to have. And so just by optimizing the bucket size, you get from 16 minutes of historical logs to 3 hours of historical logs. And just imagine you're following the other best practice we saw, which is narrow the scope of what you look for. This applies also to the hour and the time. So if you know that you want logs somewhere in the last 2 hours, but not the recent, but like, let's say an hour ago, the issue appeared and it was in the scope of the 2 hours before, then you could already reduce the size that you are scanning with this, the performance on the one hand. So you don't need to scan that many logs, but also the cost that is implied by this, you can reduce both. And this is just by setting fetch logs, from -6 hours to -4 hours. So you already know in which, and this is something you can also click in the UI, so you don't have to type this command. And Andy, so far, are there any questions that you might have or the audience?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing me and thank you for doing such a great job in explaining all of this in a nice and visual way. Great job on the slides.
Thank you.
The question that come up for me, because I can see that you are proposing here different types of buckets, maybe for different types of apps. Do we then also, as a best practice, suggest to really create buckets for every app? Or how would I then deal with this if I have hundreds or even thousands of apps? So this was something that comes to mind. I know you have additional things coming up, but this is the first feedback that I have. Does this mean I would create individual buckets for my different apps, and then maybe even per app, per environment, prod, pre-prod, dev?
It's a very good question. And this best practices guide has been created with our pre-sales teams, but also with our D1 organization working on a regular basis with customers. and with our teams that actually develop the product. And when we've built this, we've incorporated the feedback from the customers. And one thing we regularly see is that you need to look at your org structure. So one can be you build out your buckets by teams, and you break it down into the responsibilities. And if this is still not what is sufficient or enough to break it down for the size, then you can also follow the approach that we show here to, in addition, break it down by application. But we've also seen customers that say, we have mixed responsibilities. Multiple teams would want to look into certain logs for applications, and then you start breaking it down by the application, like in this example. And this is also one of the things that we show in the product documentation, this best practice, guys. Towards the end, we have an example of how you would build out this and create this. But yes, this is not a single, yes, follow this or that. So it's something that's depending a little bit also on if you go hybrid, like have cloud-based applications and on-premises-based applications, how large your organization is, if you would want to split it out by teams first or by application, or if you want to combine both of this. But that's definitely one of the things you should consider when building out those best practices. What's the best approach for you?
Cool. And also, you mentioned this in the very beginning. We are focusing on logs today, but whether it's logs, whether it's traces or spans, whether it's metrics, whether it's real user data or any type of other events like business events, everything you explained today, the bucketizing, also these strategies on what data to then query, like on what segments kind of to focus on, this obviously applies to all data sets that Grail can store. So that's why this is super great that you have done the work on visualizing this in such a nice way and providing all these best practices. But as we said, all these best practices can be applied to all other signals that we store as well.
Correct, yes. And this is also what we make use of, as I said, in the best practices guides. We break out links to how do you configure buckets in our guide. And today's session, we just focus on logs, but absolutely true, yes. So best practices, you've heard now a lot of them, and you heard me also say 1 or 2 times already that there might be people that won't follow your best practices because they've seen Dynatrace for the first time, or it's not their main solution, because in first level help desks, you have a lot of different things to look at, and you just want to use the product. And how can you make sure that these people then also follow what you want them, or that they do not increase the cost for you? And one thing we offer also as an option is retain with included queries. So we've just heard that running a query is creating consumption normally, but with the option that you can add to an existing bucket or also define on its own basis is retain with included queries. In this model, you are ingesting and retaining data, and based on this, the consumption is created. So the queries are actually included. And you can combine both. So this means a minimum of 10 days has to be configured. So this, you have to retain at least for 10 days with this option, with up to 35 days. Everything that goes beyond this mark of 35 days is then again what we are used to. So this usage-based model where IRQ, ingest retain query, applies. And this is also, and we're going to look at this a little later, possible for you then to limit certain users to only touch logs that are in this included queries scope. So this means everyone who is in first level, everyone who is an external contractor who might not follow your best practices because you haven't trained them or they just not regularly enough use Dynatrace, their queries, they will always be included. And at this point, maybe also important to call out everything from logs perspective you look at in the core apps. So in, for example, the distributed tracing app, or in the services app, or Kubernetes app, etc. So logs are in there also included, no matter in which of the both models you're using it.
Cool.
So
Just one quick question. This is really cool because for me, I work with a lot of folks that really say, "Hey, we have so much data, but we don't really know. What do I need to query? I need to, kind of do an exploratory analysis." This is why people often use either the Logs app or they create notebooks. And if I get this correctly, what I see here on the left, retain with included queries, if I specify a bucket where I say certain logs go into this bucket, and if this bucket has a retention rate between 10 and 35 days, I can opt in to say, I don't want to pay for any queries additionally. That means everything I put in there, my price volume, the data volume based licensing, then includes the query, which is a great use case if you're doing a lot of exploratory querying, I guess, and if you are.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
cool.
So I've already prepared a slide that visualizes it a little better. So these first 35 days, and it's configurable. You see it here in the right hand in the UI on the bottom. Included queries, you define a minimum of 10 or up to 35 days. Whatever you define, let's say 15 days. This is what is included, no matter if you use the Logs app, dashboards, notebooks. So this query comes included. So if you have high frequently touched dashboards, or if you have, as said, those user groups that won't follow your best practices because they just, on the one hand, maybe don't care or don't better know, for this is a great use case. And for everything that you do not want to touch that often, but you still need to retain it, then is in this second part, in the second half, just in the default mode. So when it's not as frequently queried, and you can apply this on a bucket level. So you can have one bucket that has retained with included queries and another bucket like audit logs or access logs that you don't touch very often that do not have retained with included queries at all. And it's very simple to create this. Let me show you what this actually looks like in the UI. The first thing that you need to have for this is obviously also the rate card item. So all the customers that have auto amendment in their contracts automatically have this. And there are a few customers that do not have this option in their contract. So this is where you would need to talk to your account team and get this just enabled. And as I said, as long as you don't configure it, there is no cost associated to this. So the first thing, you either create a new bucket or you can also edit an existing bucket. The UI always looks the same. So when I click on create bucket, it's going to ask us for a name. This is our test. And then we select the type logs for the bucket table type. And as soon as we do this, there is a new option showing up. And usage based is the default. So if I configure bucket for 365 days, so a year, or let's put a 0 there. Let's make it 10 years, because that's also the great thing with Grail. You can store logs for up to 10 years and always have them in access. And no rehydration or no re-indexing. It's always there, and that's the great thing. But now we want to configure to have this option retain with include queries for the first few days. As said, if I put in here 15 days, then the first 15 days, they will be always including the queries. And the model is here based on retention and not on queries that are executed. So the cost is also highly predictable. So if you are today acting as a service provider internally in your organization and you need to know ahead of time what the cost will be, this is one of the options you're looking for, especially with our new chargeback capabilities, so cost control and cost allocation.
So Christian, just so that I get this right, this means if with this bucket setting, for the first 15 days, I have a little bit of a higher price, obviously, for the volume or that I ingest, but the queries are for free. After 15 days until the 10 years period, it then goes back to the usage-based pricing.
Correct.
Awesome.
Correct.
Cool.
And some customers see this also kind of an insurance, because as you said, you kind of pay a premium for lean back cost control. I have peace of mind. I don't need to follow up with best practices for queries.
And I also see now I also understand why we probably chose the 35 days, because especially after you're making a new release and you have a certain, let's say, you release a new feature, you have a marketing campaign, then you probably want to do more queries because you want to analyze how does the system behave. And so everything that happens within a sprint or maybe within a month is where you are doing more ad hoc queries, and it's great that these are then included. Of course, it comes a little bit with a premium price on the ingest, but everything that is then older, this is great. Up to 10 years. I mean, this is unheard of, I think.
Yeah. True. And this brings us also again back to the best practices and query optimization. So what else can we do rather than just putting a patch on the lack of enablement and filtering people might do? And this is that we have something that we just earlier discussed for a moment, which is segments. A segment is something that you can apply on demand. So here in this, you still see I have access to all of the buckets that meanwhile have been optimized. So we no longer have 45 terabytes. We now got 4 terabytes. But when I run my fetch logs command and I have applied a segment, the segment was something maybe an administrator or a team has configured, or I've created it on my own for myself. The segment does do the filtering bucket. It selects the ABAC prod logs, and it selects also the Kubernetes namespace that I'm responsible for, which is ABAC. So I still can run just any command, but it is always pre-filtered. As we discussed, this segment is something that I need to apply on my own by, for example, we are now here in the Logs app, selecting here in the top segments. And there are some segments that are already pre-configured, like Kubernetes namespace. And this is then dynamic. I can now look at all the different segments that exist here in Dynatrace Playground, which you also can use and try yourself. That's what we provide to everyone who's interested. And if I select AstroShop and click apply, then now this namespace is always pre-filtered for AstroShop. And you see here I can click plus. I can also select others like service tags or create my own segments that are then pre-filtering. And so now let's just have namespace AstroShop and run query, which is the fetch logs command. And now you see everything has been pre-filtered for me. And the only thing that I notice is when I mouse over and hover here, it says Kubernetes namespace AstroShop. And this is something we then carry on over also to other views and other applications, Dynatrace applications that support segments.
And that means, as you just highlighted, segments are part of pretty much every app in Dynatrace, whether it's the Logs app, whether it's the dashboard, the Traces app. Segment support is there. And if I want to just validate that I understand this all correctly, when I specify a segment, I can basically within a bucket specify, I guess maybe it even goes beyond buckets. I just want to specify, I want to see only the data that matches certain criteria, because that's really what a segment is about. A segment is a definition of data criteria, like data that has been ingested where a log is attached with a namespace, or where a trace is attached with a particular Kubernetes node, or again, namespace to stay within the same example.
And I think a segment is addressing one specific problem that I've seen in my past before I joined Dynatrace. The networking team was finger pointing at the databases team, was finger pointing at the infrastructure team, because first they had different tools with different data interpretation and different filtering to come to the results. With Dynatrace, you ingest your networking logs, your application logs, your database logs. You just ingest all your logs you have. And with a segment, you can pre-create a filtered view, let's call it this way, where one specialist of the databases team has put together all the filters that you need to have the same truth and results that they have. And just at any time, you can select here, for example, also then on demand, put in your filters that you're interested in. Like, I want to see only the resources that are part of my Azure subscription, or in this case, Azure location East US, and I can run query. And this is just temporary. It is not added to this segment. And as said, we can also create own segments. So for example, I've created my own. So you see here, it says my segments. AWS region, I've created for demo purposes when I record videos, one that filters out some specific logs. And here is one, service errors in Azure region, in which I'm filtering for the DT entity Azure region. And I'm filtering that I only want to see the errors in there. And what I then did is I edited this. I said, I want to combine this. So the fields display, I'm putting together the display name with the Azure region ID. So sometimes teams want just to search for a unique identifier, and sometimes you want to search for a name. So with Dynatrace query language, you have so many powerful options to build dynamic filtering that just with a few select or by typing and searching will give you the results that you're actually looking for.
Cool. In your slides, I think you're heading back to the slides anyway. I have one question now. That means if I'm using segments, and to your example, now your bucket is still called ABAC. Let's assume where I'm segmenting my production logs with tier 1 and tier 2 apps, right? Let's assume we have this, and then I have a segment for my specific app. And it might be a tier 1, it might be a tier 2. When I'm adding the segment, does this also lower down my query cost, because the segment is also kind of factored in when we are scanning the data? How does this work?
Yeah, so there are different options how you can optimize the cost, and one is definitely, and it's not just cost, it's also query performance, because you don't need to touch and scan as many buckets. Is definitely also to filter down the view and the available access to buckets based on what you're looking for. So we earlier already discussed you can limit it by segment. But the other option is here to better add an identity and access management policy if you know that you always want these teams to access a specific bucket. And then you can also preset this filter to storage Kate's namespace equal AppX. So I'm limiting it on a bucket level and then limiting it to the Kubernetes namespace. And this way, individual users or user groups can only access this without adding the segment manually.
Okay, that's cool. Awesome.
And as you notice, again, the fetch logs without any adding filters or segments on top is already delivering what I'm looking for. And this is one of the great things that you can do and start with, especially if you just have a few buckets. This is a great option. But if you then want to add and apply this to multiple buckets, and I've seen customers with 70, 80 buckets, log buckets, depending how large you are, this can likely happen. You want to apply this to multiple buckets, and that you don't always need to alter and update your IAM policies. There is something we call policy boundaries. The policy boundary allows you to define, again, this storage Kate's namespace, in our case, AppX, but then to define that this applies to all of the buckets. And now you see the orange color coding here. We've got some AppX prod logs, dev logs, and access logs, but here in audit logs, actually, there is nothing. And so it just won't find anything in there. Here it would still make sense, as we said, follow the best practices, filter down to the buckets that you want. And how can we do this? Question to the audience. Correct, using segments or by typing that you want to filter it. But still, we can access all of the buckets, but we're limited to the Kubernetes namespace.
Cool.
Are there any questions before I progress to our last slide with the best practices and IAM policies?
No, the only question that I have is, again, not a question, a comment. Your slides do an amazing job in explaining all of this. Folks, if you're watching this, obviously you can rewatch that video, but also make sure to check out the best practice guide. It's called Log Management and Analytics Best Practice. You'll find it on the Dynatrace documentation. And no, it's from my perspective, it's all clear. Let's go ahead with the last section.
Good. The last slide for the policies is now, if you recall, I said during the discussion of retain with included queries that you can also limit certain users or groups to only access these first 15 days that we configured for retain with included queries. And this is what I likely want to configure in the IAM policy. If I want everyone for a certain Active Directory group or user group or whatever it is to always be filtered. But I could also do this again in the policy boundaries, so no matter where you want to have this. There is the allow storage logs read, and then we say where storage query consumption equals included. So we can specify that the consumption model is this retain with included queries, and then can limit that they can only access these specific first 15 days. By default, this is not limited. By default, everyone can access all the logs, the ones that are included, but also the ones that go beyond. If you want only power users or Dynatrace admins or whoever it should be to access this, this is where you would also then add this to your IAM policy or to your policy boundaries.
Yeah, I think this is amazingly powerful because as you're mass onboarding many new folks and many new applications, of course, it's very tempting to just query all the data at all the time, right? But with this, you basically say, we have set up Dynatrace in a way that we have certain data that is free to query for the first 15 days. And with this, you can enforce it through a policy that new team members by default only get to query the quote unquote free query data. Yeah. That's awesome.
And maybe one important thing that I also should call out, written with include queries does not mean that you should just run everything unoptimized and not following our best practices, because still you want to optimize because you get faster to your results. Everything just should follow those best practices, because maybe also someone will touch the logs that are outside of this scope, and then you want to have the best practices in place. So this is definitely still something you want to configure. And the last thing about the best practices guide is also, this is not a one-off. We are improving, we are adding new features to Dynatrace, and with this we are also adding this to the documentation. So looking at it, looking at the change date, and then looking to see if there is something new or new best practice that we've learned, that's also definitely something you should do. And if you want to learn more, there are many other things that we as Dynatrace offer. And I don't know, should I cover some of these examples, or is it you, Andy?
I think, first of all of these things that you see here, whether it's trainings, whether it's obviously events, certifications, you'll find all the relevant links in the description of this video. I think in the preparation of this session, you also brought up, we have a Learn DQL app. We have also content on Dynatrace University. I know there's also a new getting started with DQL course on University. There's more stuff happening. I think you also do we obviously do instructor-led training. We have a lot of hands-on training sessions in the different regions. But I think, Christian, what we just do, we just make sure we post all the relevant links to this video so that people find the stuff that's out there for them.
And the last slide here already shows why you would want to go to Dynatrace University. You just mentioned it. We're putting a lot of stuff there, new content, and so also this is true for log management and administration of it. So this is going to be a new course that's available, and we are also linking some of the other content, like those best practices for DQL querying and getting started with Dynatrace query language there.
Awesome. Christian, do me one quick favor. Can you go back to your first slide that you had opened with that architectural overview?
Here.
Thank you. So if I want to sum this up, folks, we have built Grail for you as a unified data lakehouse where you can ingest logs, metrics, traces, events, real user data, security data. Christian, you highlight we have different ways to ingest, whether it's through the one agent open telemetry, forwarding it from other data pipelines. The key point is the more data you put into Dynatrace, the more powerful we become. But on the other side, as you scale, you also need to think about how to correctly structure your data. The concepts that I've learned today is we have the ability to define where data gets stored. We call them buckets. I know it's a similar name to S3 buckets. That's some people may confuse this. So these are our Grail buckets where you can specify what type of data gets stored in which bucket. On the bucket level, you can specify the retention rate. What I've also learned is for logs, we have this great capability where we say up to between 10 and 35 days, you can choose between two models where queries are included with a higher premium on ingestion. Everything above there, 35 to even 10 years, we then charge per query. So we have buckets. This is great. We also have segments. Segments allow you to then additionally filter the data. That also ties into access control. So that means you can also specify who is even allowed to see what type of data. You can even limit individual users or groups to say they're only allowed to query, let's say, the data where queries are included. And all of this has been put into a great guide. It's called Log Management and Analytics Best Practice. It is a living thing because we also keep learning with every customer engagement that we have. So Christian and team, I know there's a big team behind all of this. Thank you so much for showing us and spending the time. Any final words before we close the session?
Make use of logs. Start using logs today. If you aren't, look at the best practices guides to get out the most of your environment, and always look to optimize with the tools that we offer you, like the ready-made dashboards and others.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.